Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Droning Professor. Tonight we're going to learn about Hypatia of Alexandria. So, as you make yourselves comfortable, please take a moment to let us know where you're listening from, and feel free to subscribe. Now, as always, take a moment for some deep breaths, letting your mind and body relax for a good night of sleep. Tonight, we're going to talk about a woman who lived 1600 years ago, who was so brilliant that her students would literally fight in the streets over her ideas, who became one of the most famous teachers in the ancient world, and who met an end so horrifying that historians still argue about the details out of sheer discomfort. Her name was Hypatia of Alexandria, and if you haven't heard of her, that's part of the tragedy we'll be exploring tonight. Now, before we dive in, I need to set something straight. Hypatia is one of those historical figures who has been turned into whatever people need her to be. She's been called a martyr for science, a pagan saint, a feminist icon, the last voice of reason before the Dark Ages, and probably a few other things I'm forgetting. And look, some of that is fair, but we're going to try to see her as she actually was, which is complicated, messy, and frankly more interesting than any of the myths. Also more tragic, if I'm being honest, so buckle up emotionally. Let's start with where and when. Hypatia was born in Alexandria, Egypt, probably around 355 of the Common Era, give or take a few years. Now, Alexandria, in the 4th century, wasn't just any city. This was one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. Imagine if you took Oxford, Silicon Valley, and the Library of Congress, mixed them together, and dropped them on the Mediterranean coast. That's Alexandria. The city had been founded by Alexander the Great back in 332 before the Common Era, and by Hypatia's time, it had been the jewel of learning for nearly 700 years. The city was home to what remained of the Great Library, or at least its daughter library in the Serapeum Temple, and it had the museum, which wasn't a museum in our sense, but more like an ancient research institute where scholars could study, argue, and occasionally throw things at each other over mathematical proofs. The city was a crossroads of ideas. You had Greek philosophy, Egyptian traditions, Jewish scholarship, and increasingly Christian theology, all mixing together in ways that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes explosive. Keep that tension in mind, because it matters a great deal to our story. Hypatia's father was a man named Theon of Alexandria, and this is important because Theon was not just any scholar. He was the last known member of the Museum of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer who edited and commented on Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest. In other words, Hypatia grew up in a household where people argued about geometry over dinner. Her childhood homework probably involved things that would make most of us weep. Now, we don't know much about Hypatia's mother, which is typical for ancient sources that often ignored women unless they were queens or courtesans. But we know Theon raised Hypatia in an environment of intense intellectual rigor. Here's where it gets interesting. Theon apparently decided, revolutionary though it was, to educate his daughter as if she were a son. He trained her in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. He brought her into his scholarly work. Ancient sources tell us he wanted to create a perfect human being, which sounds a bit intense if I'm honest, like those parents today who have their kids doing calculus at age 5. But whatever his motivations, the result was extraordinary. Hypatia didn't just learn these subjects, she mastered them to the point where she eventually surpassed her father's reputation. By the time she was in her 30s, Hypatia was running her own school of philosophy in Alexandria. And when I say running her own school, I don't mean she rented a room and hung out a shingle. She was teaching the elite of the Roman Empire. Her students included prominent Christians, pagans, and people from across the Mediterranean world. They didn't just respect her, they revered her. One of her students, a man named Synesius of Cyrene, who later became a Christian bishop, wrote letters to her that still survive, and they're basically gushing fan mail. He asks her advice on everything from how to construct a scientific instrument to philosophical questions about the nature of reality. So, what did Hypatia actually teach? She was part of the Neoplatonist tradition, which was the dominant philosophical school of late antiquity. Neoplatonism was founded by a philosopher named Plotinus in the 3rd century, and it was essentially a mystical interpretation of Plato's ideas, mixed with other philosophical and religious concepts. The basic idea, very simplified, is that there's an ultimate reality called the One, which is beyond all description, beyond being itself, and everything in the universe emanates from this One in descending levels of reality. You go from the One to the level of mind or intellect, then to soul, then to the material world we live in. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds extremely abstract and mystical, and you're right, it is. But Neoplatonism wasn't just about sitting around contemplating the infinite. It was deeply connected to mathematics and science because the Neoplatonists believed that mathematics was a way of ascending back toward the One, a path of purification for the soul. When you study geometry, you're not just learning about triangles. You're training your mind to move from the material world toward eternal truths. Hypatia absolutely embodied this integration of the mystical and the mathematical. We know she worked on astronomy and mathematics. She wrote commentaries on several important mathematical texts, including the Arithmetica of Diophantus, who was an Alexandrian mathematician from the 3rd century whose work laid groundwork for algebra. Diophantus worked on what we now call Diophantine equations, which are polynomial equations where you're looking for integer solutions. For example, find whole numbers x and y such that x squared plus y squared equals z squared. That's a Diophantine equation, and if you're thinking, oh, like Pythagorean triples, congratulations, you're doing mathematics from 1600 years ago. Hypatia's commentary on Diophantus doesn't survive, but we know she wrote it because later mathematicians reference it. She also worked on Apollonius of Perga's work on conic sections. Conic sections are the shapes you get when you slice a cone at different angles: circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. This might sound abstract, but this work was crucial for understanding planetary motion and later became fundamental to physics and astronomy. When Kepler in the 17th century figured out that planets move in ellipses, he was building on work that scholars like Hypatia had preserved and developed. She also edited her father's commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, which was the astronomical Bible of the ancient world. Ptolemy had created a mathematical model of the universe with Earth at the center, and all the celestial bodies moving in complex patterns of circles within circles called epicycles. Now, we know this model was wrong. The Earth orbits the Sun. Not the other way around, but the mathematics involved was incredibly sophisticated, and it predicted celestial events with remarkable accuracy. Working on the Almagest meant you were at the absolute cutting edge of mathematical astronomy. Beyond her scholarly work, Hypatia was a teacher, and by all accounts, a magnetic one. Ancient sources describe crowds gathering to hear her speak. She apparently lectured in public, not just to private students, which was unusual for a woman at the time. Actually, it was unusual for anyone, because most philosophy was taught in small groups or one-on-one, but Hypatia seems to have been enough of a celebrity that she could draw a crowd. She would walk through the city in the distinctive robes of a philosopher, the tribone, which was basically ancient academic regalia, and people recognized her. Now, here's where we need to talk about something that ancient sources fixate on, often in ways that are more revealing about the authors than about Hypatia herself, her appearance and her celibacy. Multiple sources tell us Hypatia was beautiful. They also tell us she remained unmarried and virgin throughout her life, dedicated entirely to philosophy. There are stories, probably apocryphal, about how she rejected suitors. One tale claims a student fell in love with her, and she responded by showing him a cloth stained with her menstrual blood, saying, "This is what you're in love with, not anything beautiful," which, if true, is both hilarious and a pretty clear message about her priorities. But here's the thing about all this. Ancient male authors couldn't seem to process the idea of a brilliant woman without also commenting on whether she was attractive and whether she was sexually available. It's like they needed to categorize her in those terms before they could acknowledge her intellect, and the emphasis on her virginity served multiple purposes. For pagan sources, it aligned her with the philosophical ideal of ascending above bodily needs. For later Christian sources, who admired her despite her paganism, it made her more acceptable, more like a Christian ascetic. But for Hypatia herself, remaining unmarried was probably just practical. Marriage in the ancient world meant subordination to a husband, domestic duties, childbearing. It would have been nearly impossible to maintain her scholarly career and public teaching if she'd married. So framing it as philosophical devotion was likely the only way she could justify a choice that was really about intellectual freedom. Alright, now we need to talk about the political and religious context, because this is where things start to go sideways. The Roman Empire in Hypatia's time was officially Christian. Constantine had converted in 312 and legalized Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan. By 380, under Theodosius I, Christianity was the state religion, and pagan worship was officially banned. But banning something and making it disappear are two different things. In Alexandria especially, there was still a significant pagan intellectual community, and Hypatia was at its center. Now, when I say pagan, I don't mean Hypatia was out sacrificing goats to Zeus. By this period, educated pagan philosophy was mostly about intellectual and spiritual practice through the lens of Neoplatonism. It incorporated religious elements, sure, but it was more comparable to a philosophical practice than what we might think of as ancient polytheistic religion. Still, from a Christian perspective, this was problematic. The church was consolidating power, and pagan intellectuals represented both a theological threat and a political one. Alexandria was also politically volatile. The city had a history of riots and street violence between different factions. You had tensions between Christians and pagans, between Christians and Jews, between different Christian sects arguing over theological fine points, and between everyone and the imperial authorities. The Christian bishop of Alexandria at this time was a man named Cyril, who would later be declared a saint, but who was, by most accounts, an absolute political bruiser. He took office in 412 after his uncle Theophilus died, and he immediately started consolidating power and going after rivals. Cyril had a complicated relationship with the imperial governor of Egypt, a man named Orestes. Orestes was Christian, but he was also a political moderate who believed in maintaining civic order and protecting all citizens, including pagans and Jews. Hypatia was close to Orestes. She was his advisor and friend. Some sources suggest she had significant political influence through this relationship. This made her a target. In 415, tensions in the city exploded. There had been increasing violence between Cyril's supporters, including a group of fanatical Christian monks from the desert and Orestes' administration. The monks, called the Parabolani, were essentially a militia. They'd come into the city and gotten into a street fight with Orestes' supporters. One monk threw a rock and hit Orestes in the head. Orestes had the monk arrested and executed, which infuriated Cyril. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, and Hypatia was caught in the middle. Here's what happened, and I'm going to be straightforward about this because the ancient sources are, even though they're clearly uncomfortable with the details. In March of 415, during Lent, a mob of Christians ambushed Hypatia's chariot on the street. They dragged her from the chariot to a building identified as either a church or the Caesareum, which had been converted to a church. There, they stripped her naked. Then they murdered her, and the sources describe this murder in terms that suggest it was both brutal and ritualistic. The primary source, a church historian named Socrates Scholasticus, says they used ostraca, which means either roof tiles or shells, to scrape the flesh from her bones. Afterward, they burned her remains. I'm going to pause for a moment here, because this is genuinely difficult material. This was a torture murder carried out by a mob, and the victim was one of the great intellectuals of her age, killed essentially for being too visible, too influential, and on the wrong side of a political conflict. The attack was likely orchestrated, or at minimum encouraged, by a reader in Cyril's church named Peter, though Cyril himself denied direct involvement. Whether he ordered it, enabled it, or just created the conditions for it remains debated, but he certainly benefited from it. Hypatia's death eliminated a powerful symbol of pagan learning and removed a key advisor to his political rival. In the immediate aftermath, some of Hypatia's students fled Alexandria. The pagan intellectual community was shattered. Orestes apparently tried to investigate, but he had limited power and was eventually recalled from the governorship. Cyril faced no consequences. In fact, he continued as bishop, consolidated his power further, and his legacy in the church was secure enough that he was eventually canonized as a saint. The murder of Hypatia sent a message. The age of tolerance for pagan philosophy in Alexandria was over. While some philosophical teaching continued, the kind of public, visible intellectual culture that Hypatia represented was finished. Some historians see her death as symbolic of the end of classical antiquity, the moment when the old intellectual world was definitively replaced by Christian dominance. That might be overstating things a bit, because intellectual life continued, and Christian scholars certainly engaged with philosophy and mathematics. But something was lost. The open, cosmopolitan intellectual culture of Alexandria, where you could study Plato and Ptolemy regardless of your religious identity, was dying. Now, let's talk about what happened to Hypatia's legacy, because this gets complicated. In the immediate centuries after her death, she was mostly remembered in church histories, where she appears as either a tragic figure or, in some less sympathetic accounts, as someone who'd been involved in dark magic and got what was coming to her. The latter interpretation was clearly propaganda meant to justify or minimize the horror of her murder. But there was also a strand of Christian writers, like Socrates Scholasticus, who clearly thought her killing was unjust and shameful. For about 1,000 years, Hypatia was mostly forgotten outside specialized histories of the Church and Alexandria. But in the Enlightenment, she was rediscovered. 18th century intellectuals, who were themselves often in conflict with religious authority, seized on Hypatia as a martyr for reason and free inquiry. Voltaire mentioned her, Edward Gibbon, in his Massive Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1789, portrayed her death as evidence of Christian fanaticism destroying classical civilization. This interpretation has its own problems because it oversimplifies the religious politics of late antiquity, but it established Hypatia in the modern imagination. In the 19th century, she became a figure in fiction and art. There was a novel about her by Charles Kingsley in 1853 that was basically anti-Catholic propaganda dressed up as historical fiction. She appeared in poems, paintings, operas. Usually in these portrayals, she was made into a symbol of whatever the author wanted to champion, which often said more about 19th century anxieties than about the historical Hypatia. But at least she was being remembered. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Hypatia has been embraced by several different communities. Feminists have rightly claimed her as an example of a brilliant woman whose intellectual contributions were cut short by misogynist violence. Carl Sagan featured her in his Cosmos series, presenting her as a scientist standing against religious irrationality. There was a 2009 film about her called Agora, starring Rachel Weisz, which took considerable liberties with the history but brought her story to a wider audience. She's become, in many ways, a secular saint, which is ironic given that she herself was a deeply religious philosopher, just not Christian. But here's what I want us to sit with for a moment. The real Hypatia was a Neoplatonist philosopher and mathematician working in the complex intellectual and political world of late ancient Alexandria. She made genuine contributions to mathematics and astronomy, though most of her written work is lost. She was a beloved teacher who seems to have had remarkable skill at making complex ideas accessible and at inspiring devotion in her students. She navigated gender barriers in a way that was extraordinary for her time, though she likely had to make significant personal sacrifices to do so. She was also a real person living in a real city that was tearing itself apart over religious and political conflicts she probably wished she could ignore, but couldn't because she was too prominent, too connected, too valuable as a symbol. And in the end, she was murdered by people who didn't kill her for her ideas. Not really. They killed her because she represented something they wanted to destroy, because she was a convenient scapegoat in a political conflict, because she was vulnerable despite her prominence, and because violence was the language that conflict was conducted in. What does Hypatia's story tell us? Well, it's a reminder that knowledge has never been safe or neutral. It exists in political contexts, and people who pursue it publicly can become targets. It's a reminder that intellectual communities are fragile things that can be destroyed by violence and intolerance. It's a reminder of how much we've lost. We have only fragments of Hypatia's work, references in other people's writing. We'll never read her commentary on Diophantus or see her full thoughts on Apollonius. That's a loss, not just for historical curiosity, but for human knowledge. Her story is also a reminder about the politics of memory. For 1600 years, people have been arguing about what Hypatia means, who she was, and what lesson we should draw from her life and death. She's been a pagan martyr, a Christian cautionary tale, an Enlightenment icon of reason, a feminist symbol, a warning about religious violence, and probably a dozen other things I haven't mentioned. The fact that we're still arguing about her suggests that her story touches something that still matters to us. But I think the most important thing about Hypatia is actually simpler than all of that. She was a person who loved knowledge enough to dedicate her life to it in a world that made that extraordinarily difficult for someone of her gender. She was good enough at mathematics and astronomy and philosophy that students traveled from across the Mediterranean to study with her. She taught people not just information, but how to think, how to approach problems, how to see the world through the lens of reason and mathematics. And she did it in a way that seems to have been joyful and generous, not dry or pedantic. Her students loved her, and that's actually pretty rare for teachers at any level. When that mob dragged her from her chariot in March of 415, they destroyed not just a person but a connection to an entire intellectual tradition. They broke a chain of knowledge transmission that had stretched back centuries. Yes, much of what she knew was preserved in other ways, in other texts, through other scholars. Mathematics and astronomy didn't die with her. But the particular way she understood and taught those subjects, the insights she might have had, the students she might have taught who would have gone on to their own discoveries, all of that was lost. We tend to think of intellectual progress as inevitable, as if knowledge just naturally accumulates over time. But that's not how it works. Knowledge is maintained through people learning it, understanding it, and passing it on. Break that chain anywhere, and you lose things. The decline of learning in Western Europe after the fall of Rome, what we call the Dark Ages, wasn't because people got stupider. It was because the institutional structures that preserved and transmitted knowledge broke down. Libraries were destroyed or abandoned. Schools closed. The people who knew how to read the old texts died without training successors. Hypatia's death was a microcosm of that larger collapse. There's also something specific in her story about women's access to intellectual life. Hypatia proved that a woman could be not just competent but excellent, not just a scholar but a leading scholar, in the most demanding fields of ancient learning. And what happened? She was murdered, and for the next 1,000 years plus, women were largely excluded from formal higher education in the Christian West. Now, You can't draw a straight line from Hypatia's death to that exclusion. But the fact that one of the most prominent female intellectuals in ancient history was killed by a Christian mob probably didn't help the cause of women's education in Christian societies. I don't want to overstate this. There were learned women in medieval convents, and women who found ways to study and write despite the barriers. But they had to work around systems that presumed they shouldn't be there. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that women gained broad access to universities and academic careers. Hypatia's example suggests what was possible and what was lost when those possibilities were closed off. Let me bring this to a close by talking about what we can actually learn from Hypatia that might be useful for us. First, the integration of different kinds of knowledge. Hypatia didn't see a wall between mathematics and philosophy, between technical skills and wisdom about how to live. Her Neoplatonism held that mathematical truth was part of spiritual truth, that studying geometry was a way of purifying the soul. Now, you don't have to buy into Neoplatonist metaphysics to appreciate the idea that different forms of knowledge connect to each other, that you understand mathematics better if you also think philosophically, and vice versa. Second, teaching matters. What we know about Hypatia comes largely from the impact she had on her students. Synesius of Cyrene wrote to her decades after studying with her, still seeking her guidance. That's the mark of a great teacher. Someone who doesn't just transmit information but transforms how students think. In a world that increasingly treats education as credentialing, as jumping through hoops to get a job, Hypatia reminds us that teaching can be about forming minds and even souls. Third, intellectual courage. Hypatia lived in a time of increasing intolerance, where being publicly identified with the wrong philosophical school could be dangerous. She could have kept her head down, taught privately, avoided the public sphere. She didn't. She maintained her visibility, her public teaching, her role as an advisor to civic leaders. You can argue about whether that was wise. It certainly wasn't safe. But it was courageous, and it mattered. Her students learned from someone who embodied the idea that knowledge was worth standing up for. And fourth, the fragility of intellectual community. Alexandria didn't have to descend into the violence that killed Hypatia. There were Christians and pagans who lived and worked together, who learned from each other. Hypatia had Christian students who revered her. Orestes, the governor who tried to protect her, was Christian. The tragedy isn't just that Christianity and paganism were incompatible, but that political actors used that difference as a weapon, and a mob was willing to commit murder over it. The lesson here isn't about any particular religion, but about how intellectual life requires a degree of tolerance, of willingness to engage with difference, and how quickly that can collapse when people decide that ideological purity matters more than human life. We live in a time of increasing polarization, where people sort themselves into ideological tribes, where differences over ideas can feel like existential threats, where experts and intellectuals are sometimes treated with suspicion or hostility. Hypatia's story is a warning about where that can lead. But it's also an inspiration because despite everything, despite the dangers, despite the eventual tragedy, she spent decades teaching, thinking, advancing human knowledge, and making a difference in people's lives. The mob could kill her body, but they couldn't actually destroy what she stood for, because here we are, 1600 years later, still talking about her, still inspired by her, still trying to learn from her example. So yes, Hypatia's death was a tragedy. It was an injustice that was never rectified. It represented a closure of intellectual possibility at a crucial historical moment. But her life was a triumph. She achieved things that shouldn't have been possible for a woman in her era. She mastered fields that challenge us even today. She taught people who went on to be bishops and statesmen and scholars themselves. And she left us an example of what it means to commit yourself to knowledge, to teaching, to the life of the mind, regardless of the obstacles. The details of how to calculate conic sections or solve Diophantine equations Those are technical matters you can look up. What you can't look up, what you have to learn from someone who embodies it, is what it means to care about those things not just as facts, but as part of a larger vision of human possibility. That's what Hypatia taught, and that's what made her dangerous to people who wanted to narrow human possibility, to make everyone think the same way, to eliminate difference and dissent. We don't have Hypatia's writings. We can't hear her voice directly. We know her mostly through the words of others, through fragments and references and the echoes of her influence. But maybe that's appropriate. Great teachers live on not in what they write, but in how they shape the people they teach. Hypatia lives on in Synesius and the other students she influenced, and through them in the intellectual traditions they carried forward. She lives on in everyone who's inspired by her example to pursue knowledge despite barriers. She lives on in every woman who studies mathematics or philosophy or astronomy, and who carries forward that tradition of rigorous thinking that Hypatia represented. In the end, what do we owe Hypatia? We owe her memory, certainly. We owe her the effort to understand her in her own context, rather than just making her into a symbol for our own concerns. We owe her the commitment to keep studying the subjects she loved, to preserve and transmit knowledge the way she did. And maybe we owe her the determination to create intellectual communities that are more durable, more inclusive, and more resistant to the kind of violence that destroyed her. 1610 years ago, a mob killed one of the great minds of late antiquity on the streets of Alexandria. They thought they were eliminating a problem, removing a political obstacle, striking a blow for their faction. What they actually did was create a martyr, inspire countless others across the centuries, and guarantee that Hypatia of Alexandria would be remembered long after their names were forgotten. That's not justice. Justice would have been her living to old age, writing more commentaries, teaching more students, making more discoveries. But it's something. It means that in some small way, the knowledge and the commitment to learning that she represented survived the violence that tried to destroy it. Good night. And in case you've enjoyed our evening talk so much and still might be awake, here is another educational video for you.